Jake Morrison stood on the bridge of his ship watching the emergency signals flood his screen like angry red stars. Each blinking light meant another human colony was crying for help, and each cry meant more people were about to die. The Carathians were coming, and nothing had ever stopped them before. Commander Morrison had seen the reports from 17 different star systems that had fallen to these aliens in just 5 years. The pattern was always the same. First came the massive black, ships that blocked out the sun. Then came the Harvester Corps with their 12-foot-tall bodies covered in living armor that could stop any weapon. Their arms weren't arms at all, but energy cannons grown right into their flesh. When they died, they didn't stay dead for long, because their technology could bring them back stronger than before. The communication system crackled, and Admiral Lisa Carter's voice filled the bridge. Her words were calm, but Jake could hear the fear underneath. The Carathians had hit the outer colonies 3 days ago and were moving toward Earth faster than anyone expected. Every defense had failed. Every weapon was useless. Every strategy had been tried and found wanting. Jake turned to his crew and saw the same fear in their eyes that he felt in his chest. Lieutenant Amy Stone was checking weapon systems that wouldn't help against an enemy like this. Chief Petty Officer Carl Young was running diagnostics on engines that couldn't run fast enough to escape what was coming. They all knew the truth that no one wanted to say out loud. Humanity was about to become extinct. The Emergency Council meeting on Earth was unlike anything in human history. Military leaders from every colony and outpost had gathered in the great hall that usually hosted peace talks and trade agreements. Today, it would decide whether humanity had any future at all. Dr. Ben Phillips walked to the center of the room, carrying data chips that contained everything they knew about their enemy. Phillips activated the holographic display, and the room filled with images of death. The Altarian Federation had possessed the largest fleet anyone had ever seen. 1 million ships with crews trained for centuries in the art of war. The battle lasted 3 days, and when it was over, not a single Altarian ship remained. The Carathians had harvested the biological material from every fallen warrior and used it to make their own forces stronger. The crystalline beings of Vega Prime were next. These creatures were made of pure energy and had thought themselves impossible to kill or capture. They were wrong. Somehow the Carathians had found a way to trap living energy itself and turn it into weapons. The crystal beings now served as power sources for the alien war machines that had once been their enemies. Every species that faced the Carathians made the same mistakes. They used their best technology and their finest warriors. They followed proper military tactics and fought with honor and courage. None of it mattered because the Carathians could adapt to anything they faced. Their biomechanical nature meant they could change their bodies to resist new weapons. Their resurrection, technology meant death was just a temporary setback. Most terrifying of all was their ability to learn from every battle and become stronger from every defeat they inflicted on others. Dr. Phillips showed them recordings from the Battle of Kepler Station where 10,000 human Marines had made their last stand. The Carathians studied every move the humans made, and by the end of the battle their warriors could predict every human tactic before it happened. The Marines fought bravely, but bravery meant nothing against an enemy that could see the future. Admiral Carter stood up slowly, and the room fell silent. She had commanded fleets in 3 different wars and had never lost a battle until now. Her voice was steady as she explained what everyone already knew. The evacuation ships were already leaving the outer colonies. Millions of people were abandoning homes their families had built over generations. Soon the inner colonies would follow, and then Earth itself would stand alone against an enemy that had never known defeat. The meeting ended with orders that no one wanted to give or receive. Every available ship would join the defense fleet, even if it meant stripping colonies of their last protection. Every weapon factory would work day and night to build guns that probably wouldn't work against Carathian armor. Every person who could hold a weapon would be trained to fight an enemy they couldn't hope to defeat. Jake Morrison received his orders 6 hours later. Take his ship to the edge of human space and watch for the enemy fleet, report their movements, and retreat if they came too close. Don't try to fight, because fighting would only help them learn how to kill humans more efficiently. The mission was simple, but the truth behind it was terrible. They were being sent to witness the beginning of the end of everything they had ever known or loved. As his ship jumped to hyperspace, Jake looked at the pictures of his family on his desk and wondered if he would ever see them again. The Carathians were 6 months away from Earth, but they had never been stopped before, and there was no reason to think they could be stopped now. Captain Ryan Brooks never expected to find anyone alive in the wreckage of Proxima Station. The massive space habitat had been home to 50,000 people just a week ago, but now it drifted through space like a broken toy. Pieces of metal and debris floated everywhere, and most of it was still glowing from the energy weapons that had torn the station apart. His ship, the Defiant, moved carefully through the wreckage field while sensors searched for any sign of life. They had been sent to gather intelligence about Carathian tactics, but Brooks didn't expect to find much useful information. Every other battle site had told the same story. The aliens attacked with overwhelming force and perfect coordination. They adapted to every defense and learned from every weapon used against them. Then they harvested biological material from the dead to make themselves stronger. Lieutenant Amy Stone was using the ship's scanners to map the damage when she detected something impossible. A faint life sign was coming from what had been the engineering section of the station. Brooks ordered his crew to investigate, even though he knew it was probably just a malfunctioning sensor reading. Nothing could survive what the Carathians had done to this place, but Amy Stone was not dead, and she was very much alive. They found her in an emergency shelter that had somehow survived the destruction around it. She was unconscious and badly injured, but she was breathing. More importantly, she was clutching a data recorder that might contain information about the battle. Brooks ordered his medical team to treat her injuries while he tried to access the recorder. Stone woke up 3 hours later in the ship's medical bay and immediately started talking about something that didn't make sense. She kept saying that the engineers had done something during the final battle that had stopped the Carathians for a few minutes. She claimed that Chief Petty Officer Carl Young had built some kind of device from spare parts that had actually hurt the alien warriors. Brooks listened to her story with growing excitement. According to Stone, the battle had been going exactly like every other Carathian victory. The aliens were systematically destroying the station's defenses and adapting to every weapon the humans used against them. The resurrection technology was working perfectly, and every fallen Carathian warrior was coming back to life stronger than before. Then something changed. Young and his engineering team had been trapped in a maintenance section with no weapons and no way to escape. Instead of giving up, they had started building something from whatever they could find: old computer parts and broken machinery, and even pieces of the station's plumbing. They worked with desperate energy while the battle raged around them, and somehow they created a device that could disrupt Carathian technology. When they activated their improvised weapon, something unprecedented happened. The Carathian resurrection. Systems stopped working. Warriors who had been killed stayed dead. The living armor that protected the aliens began to malfunction. For exactly 4 minutes and 37 seconds, the unstoppable Carathian advance came to a complete halt. Then the aliens adapted to the new threat, and the device stopped working. But those few minutes had been enough to save Stone's life. Brooks immediately sent Stone's report to Admiral Carter on Earth, and the response came back within hours. Every scientist and engineer in human space was ordered to study what had happened at Proxima Station. Dr. Mary Kim was put in charge of a special research team that would analyze human psychological patterns and compare them to data about other species that had fought the Carathians. Kim's findings changed everything. Every species that had fallen to the Carathians had one thing in common. They fought with their best technology and most advanced weapons. They used proven tactics and established strategies. They did exactly what any reasonable military force would do when facing a superior enemy. And that was exactly why they lost. The Altarians had incredible technology, but they used it in predictable ways. Their million-ship fleet followed classic battle formations that had worked for centuries. When those formations failed, they tried minor variations, but they never tried anything completely different. The Carathians could adapt to gradual changes, but they had never faced an enemy that threw away everything they knew and started over from scratch. The crystalline beings of Vega Prime had even greater problems. Their energy-based nature meant they thought in terms of pure logic and mathematical precision. They could calculate the optimal solution to any problem, but they couldn't imagine solutions that weren't optimal. When the Carathians proved immune to optimal tactics, the crystal beings had no backup plan. Humans were different in ways that no one had understood before. The human brain was designed to find patterns in chaos and create order from confusion. More importantly, humans could throw away failed solutions and try something completely different without hesitation. What other species saw as flaws in human thinking were actually humanity's greatest strengths. Dr. Kim presented her research to Admiral Carter and the Military Council with growing excitement. Humans didn't just think outside the box, they often forgot there was a box at all. Chief Young and his team hadn't followed proper procedures when they built their device. They had violated safety regulations and ignored technical specifications. They had created something that shouldn't work, according to established science. And it had worked anyway because sometimes the impossible solution is the only solution that works. Admiral Carter made a decision that would have seemed insane just days earlier. Instead of fighting the Carathians with humanity's most advanced weapons, they would fight them with humanity's most unpredictable people. Operation Wildcard was born from desperation and hope in equal measure. They would take everything they thought they knew about warfare and throw it away. The first test would come at the mining colony of Kepler 442b, where Colonel Steve Murphy was assembling the strangest military unit in human history. His soldiers included mechanics and janitors and artists and engineers. People who had never been trained for combat, but who knew how to solve impossible problems with whatever tools they had available. Brooks received new orders while Stone was still recovering from her injuries. Take the Defiant to Kepler 442b and observe the first battle between humans who fought like humans and aliens who had never lost a war. Document everything and be ready to run if the experiment failed. But for the first time since the war began, Brooks felt something he hadn't felt. In months, he felt hope. Colonel Steve Murphy watched his strange new army prepare for battle and wondered if he was about to make military history or just get everyone killed. The mining world of Kepler 442b had never been considered strategically important before, but now it was humanity's testing ground for the most unconventional warfare experiment ever attempted. His Chaos Corps consisted of 200 volunteers who had no formal military training, but plenty of experience solving impossible problems with limited resources. Sergeant Lisa Park was welding armor plates onto a mining truck while explaining to anyone who would listen how internal combustion engines could be modified to run on refined asteroid ore. She had spent 10 years fixing broken machinery in places where replacement parts didn't exist, and ordering new equipment meant waiting 6 months for a supply ship. Now she was applying those same skills to turn civilian vehicles into weapons that no military manual had ever described. The Carathian fleet arrived exactly when intelligence predicted they would, but they didn't find the orderly defensive positions they expected. Instead of bunkers and barricades, the mining colony looked almost abandoned. A few scattered vehicles moved around the settlement in seemingly random patterns. Sensor scans detected human life signs, but no concentrated military presence. The aliens prepared for another quick victory against an enemy that apparently didn't know how to mount a proper defense. Tony Garcia had been the head chef at the colony's main restaurant until 3 days ago when Murphy recruited him for the Chaos Corps. Now he was crouched in what used to be his kitchen mixing chemicals that the mining operation used to extract precious metals from asteroids. The compounds were never meant to be combined in the proportions he was using, but Garcia had learned long ago that cooking was really just chemistry with better smells. When the first Carathian dropships landed near the main settlement, they encountered resistance that their tactical computers couldn't analyze. The mining trucks that had seemed so harmless began moving in coordinated patterns that made no mathematical sense, but somehow created effective crossfire positions. Weapons that registered as civilian mining equipment were firing projectiles that shouldn't have been able to penetrate Carathian armor, but were doing exactly that. The alien warriors advanced according to their established tactics, but found themselves fighting enemies that refused to follow any recognizable military doctrine. Private Kelly White had been a circus performer before volunteering for Murphy's unit, and she moved through the battlefield like she was still performing for an audience. She used ventilation shafts and maintenance tunnels to reach positions that proper military thinking said were impossible to attack from. Lisa Park's modified mining trucks were causing more confusion than damage, but confusion was exactly what Murphy wanted. The vehicles followed no tactical pattern that Carathian computers could predict because there was no pattern to predict. Each driver made their own decisions about where to go and what to shoot at based on instincts and experience rather than military training. The result was chaos, but it was controlled chaos that somehow worked. The Carathians tried to adapt their tactics as they had done in every previous battle, but adaptation required understanding what they were adapting to. How could they counter weapons that were built from mining equipment and kitchen supplies using techniques that violated established engineering principles but worked anyway? Their resurrection technology was functioning perfectly, but warriors who came back from the dead found themselves facing completely different threats than the ones that had killed them. Garcia's improvised explosives were particularly effective because they used chemical reactions that weren't supposed to be possible under battlefield conditions. The aliens' adaptive armor could adjust to known explosive types, but these devices created entirely new forms of destruction that followed rules Garcia had learned from years of cooking rather than weapons design. When the armor tried to adapt, to protect against one type of explosion, Garcia would create a completely different type using ingredients from the colony's food storage. The battle that was supposed to last 2 hours stretched into its second day, and the Carathians were experiencing something they had never encountered before. Casualties among their forces were mounting, and their adaptation systems were struggling to process the constant stream of new and unpredictable threats. Every time they developed a counter to one human innovation, the humans would abandon that approach and try something completely different. Kelly White had turned the colony's playground equipment into a mobile command post that could be assembled and disassembled in minutes. Military doctrine said command posts should be heavily fortified and defended, but White's installation was designed to move constantly and never present the same profile twice. When Carathian forces converged on her position, they found empty playground equipment, while White coordinated attacks from inside a school bus that had been modified with extra armor and communications gear. Murphy coordinated his forces from a position that changed hourly and used communication methods that ranged from encrypted radio to hand signals to messages written on pieces of paper and delivered by people riding bicycles. The Carathians could intercept radio communications and decode digital signals, but they couldn't predict which communication method the humans would use next, because the humans often didn't know themselves until they needed to send a message. By the third day of fighting, the aliens were bringing in reinforcements and specialist equipment designed to counter human unpredictability. But the human defenders were also learning and adapting in ways the Carathians couldn't anticipate. Garcia had moved his chemical laboratory into the colony's water treatment plant, where he could use the existing infrastructure to create larger and more complex explosive devices. Park had welded together pieces from 6 different mining machines to create a mobile fortress that moved like a drunken robot, but somehow always ended up in the right place at the right time. The battle for Kepler 442b ended after 2 weeks when the Carathians finally overwhelmed the human defenders through sheer numbers and firepower. But their victory came at a cost that shocked their high command. Nearly a third of their assault force had been destroyed or damaged by an enemy that shouldn't have been able to hurt them at all. More troubling was the fact that their adaptation systems had never fully adjusted to human tactics, because humans kept changing those tactics faster than alien technology could process the changes. When the survivors of Murphy's Chaos Corps were evacuated by rescue ships, they brought with them data that would change the course of the war. Humans could fight the Carathians and win individual engagements. The key was never fighting the same way twice, and always being ready to abandon any tactic the moment it stopped working. The aliens could adapt to anything humans could do, but they couldn't adapt fast enough if humans never stopped changing what they were doing. News of the extended battle spread through human space faster than the official reports. For the first time since the war began, humans had something more precious than hope. They had proof that the enemy could be beaten if they were willing to fight like humans, instead of trying to fight like proper soldiers. Captain Laura Bell received the defense assignment for New Pittsburgh with mixed feelings about what had happened at Kepler 442b. The mining colony had held out for 2 weeks instead of 2 hours, which proved humans could slow down the Carathian advance. But it had still fallen, and most of the defenders had died in the process. Now the aliens were approaching New Pittsburgh with modified tactics designed to counter human unpredictability, and Bell wondered if lightning could strike twice. The industrial world of New Pittsburgh was different from the mining colony in important ways. Where Kepler 442b had been a small settlement with limited resources, New Pittsburgh was a major manufacturing center with facilities that produced everything from starship components to household appliances. Factory worker Danny Price looked at the massive assembly lines and conveyor systems and saw weapons that military planners had never imagined. Dr. Helen Ross was studying intelligence reports about the approaching Carathian fleet when she noticed something that made her call Admiral Carter immediately. The aliens were bringing new types of warriors to this battle, specialists that seemed designed to counter specific human tactics observed at Kepler 442b. The enemy was learning from their previous encounter, but Ross suspected they were learning the wrong lessons. The Carathians expected the humans to use the same improvised tactics that had worked before, so they brought countermeasures designed to handle mining equipment converted to weapons and chemical explosives made from food supplies. What they didn't expect was for humans to throw away their previous successes and start over with completely new approaches to warfare. Danny Price had worked in the factories of New Pittsburgh for 15 years, and he understood industrial machinery in ways that military engineers never could. He looked at the automated assembly lines that built components for space stations and realized they could build other things as well. With a few modifications, the systems that manufactured hull plating could produce armor for improvised vehicles. The conveyor belts that moved finished products could transport ammunition to fighting positions that didn't exist on any battlefield map. When the Carathians arrived, they found a settlement that looked almost normal from orbit. The factories were still running, and the worker housing areas showed signs of normal activity. Sensor scans detected the expected human population, but no obvious military preparations. The aliens deployed their anti-improvisation specialists and prepared to counter the tactics they had studied from the previous battle. The first surprise came when swarms of small drones emerged from the factory complexes and attacked the landing. Craft with coordinated precision that no human pilot could maintain. Price had reprogrammed the assembly line robotics to build simple flying machines, using spare parts from a dozen different product lines. Each drone was slightly different from the others because they were assembled from whatever components happened to be available when they reached the construction phase. The Carathians had brought jamming equipment designed to disrupt human communications and coordination, but the drone swarms weren't being controlled by human operators. They were following programs that Price had adapted from the factory management software that normally coordinated production schedules. The aliens could jam radio signals, but they couldn't interfere with manufacturing protocols that treated enemy ships like defective products to be removed from the assembly line. Marine Colonel Pete Davis was training his new type of soldiers in a converted warehouse where they practiced tactics that had no names because no one had ever used them before. These troops learned to fight with whatever they could find rather than relying on specific weapons or equipment. They studied chaos theory and probability mathematics alongside weapon maintenance because understanding randomness was more important than marksmanship when facing an enemy that could adapt to any predictable threat. The ground battle for New Pittsburgh became a three-dimensional puzzle that changed its shape every few minutes. The factory complexes provided perfect cover for defenders who knew how to use industrial equipment as weapons, but the maze-like layout also confused attacking forces that expected to fight in open terrain. Price had modified the conveyor belt systems to create rapid transit networks that could move defenders from one fighting position to another faster than Carathian tactical computers could track their movements. The aliens brought their resurrection. Technology as always, but Helen Ross had been studying the data from Kepler 442b, and she thought she understood how it worked. The biomechanical warriors needed constant communication with their command hierarchy to coordinate the enhancement process that brought them back from death. If that communication could be disrupted at precisely the right moment, the resurrection process might fail or even backfire. Ross worked with the factory's communication technicians to build transmitters that could broadcast on the same frequencies the Carathians used for their internal coordination. Instead of trying to jam their signals, she wanted to feed false information into their networks during critical moments. The idea was untested and dangerous, but it was also the kind of unpredictable approach that seemed to work against these enemies. The breakthrough came during the third day of fighting when one of the alien specialists was killed by a modified industrial robot, and the resurrection process began normally. At the exact moment when the enhancement systems activated, Ross triggered her false signal transmitters and fed contradictory data into the Carathian network. Instead of coming back stronger, the warriors' biomechanical systems malfunctioned and caused a feedback loop that disabled 3 other nearby aliens. Price watched the battle from a control room that had been designed to monitor factory production, but now tracked combat throughout the industrial complex. His drone swarms were evolving their tactics in real time as their simple artificial intelligence programs adapted to enemy countermeasures. Unlike human intelligence that followed patterns, the factory software created randomness as a natural byproduct of trying to optimize efficiency with limited resources. The Carathians were losing more forces than they had ever lost in a single battle, but they were also learning at an unprecedented rate. Their specialist units were gathering data about human industrial warfare that would help them prepare for future encounters. By the time they finally overwhelmed the defenders of New Pittsburgh, they understood human tactics well enough to develop specific countermeasures for manufacturing-based defense systems. Davis evacuated his surviving troops with valuable lessons about fighting enemies that could learn from every encounter. The key was never to become attached to any particular tactic or technique, no matter how successful it might be in the short term. Humans had to be willing to abandon their victories and find completely new ways to fight before the enemy could adapt to their previous successes. The war was becoming a race between human creativity and Carathian adaptation. Each battle taught. Both sides knew lessons about their enemies, but humans seemed to be learning faster because they were willing to throw away everything they knew and start over whenever necessary. The question was whether human innovation could stay ahead of alien evolution long enough to find a way to win the war instead of just slowing down their inevitable defeat. Bell transmitted her final report as her evacuation ship jumped to hyperspace and left New Pittsburgh to its fate. The industrial world had held out for 10 days instead of the expected few hours, and the aliens had paid a terrible price for their victory. More importantly, the battle had proved that humans could innovate faster than Carathians could adapt if they refused to repeat their previous successes and kept finding new ways to fight an ancient enemy. General Sam Clark stood on the observation deck of Titan Station, watching the largest Carathian fleet ever assembled approach the last major stronghold between the aliens and Earth itself. 300 massive black ships moved through space, in perfect formation, while smaller vessels darted between them like predatory fish. Intelligence reports suggested this fleet carried enough firepower to destroy entire star systems and enough warriors to conquer a dozen worlds. They were coming to end humanity's resistance once and for all. The orbital stations around Titan had been humanity's greatest engineering achievement before the war began. Massive structures that harvested resources from Saturn's moon system and provided stopping points for ships traveling between Earth and the outer colonies. Now they would serve as the final testing ground for everything humans had learned about fighting an enemy that could adapt to any conventional strategy. Clark's defense plan was unlike anything in military history because it wasn't really a plan at all. Instead of coordinating his forces according to established tactical doctrine, he had given each unit complete freedom to fight however they thought best. The only requirement was to survive as long as possible and cause maximum confusion for the enemy. Every commander, from ship captains to squad leaders, would make their own decisions about how to engage the Carathians. Pilot Nancy Green was making final preparations on her modified cargo hauler when the alien fleet entered weapons range. Her ship had been designed to transport mining equipment between asteroids, but Clark's engineers had added magnetic grapples powerful enough to manipulate chunks of debris the size of small buildings. Green's mission was simple in concept, but insane in execution. She would use her ship's industrial equipment to turn the battlefield itself into a weapon. The space battle began when the Carathians launched their first wave of attack craft expecting to encounter the organized resistance. They had learned to counter at previous battles. Instead, they found individual human ships operating according to no recognizable tactical pattern. Some vessels attacked directly, while others seemed to retreat, then suddenly appeared from unexpected angles. A few ships appeared to be completely ignoring the battle while they performed seemingly random maneuvers in empty space. Green's cargo hauler was one of the ships that seemed to be ignoring the main battle, but her apparent retreat was actually the first phase of an attack plan that no military computer could have predicted. She used her magnetic grapples to collect debris from destroyed Carathian ships and accelerated the metal fragments to incredible velocities using her ship's industrial manipulator arms. The result was a constant stream of projectiles that moved in patterns no targeting system could anticipate. On the surface installations, the battle was even more chaotic. Construction foreman Rick Johnson had turned the station's building equipment into weapons that fought like mechanical beasts instead of military vehicles. Concrete pumpers became artillery pieces that could fire different types of ammunition, depending on which construction materials happened to be loaded at any given moment. Magnetic cranes became kinetic weapons that could hurl objects along trajectories that followed no ballistic principles. The Carathians had brought their most advanced tactical computers and their most experienced commanders to this final battle, but both were struggling to process the sheer randomness of human strategy. Their resurrection technology was working normally, but warriors who came back from death found themselves facing completely different threats than the ones that had killed them. Worse yet, the humans seemed to be changing their tactics faster than the aliens could die and come back to life. Construction mechs that had been designed to build orbital habitats were fighting like drunken giants that somehow always ended up in the right place at the wrong time for their enemies. Johnson had programmed them using construction management software that optimized efficiency rather than tactical effectiveness, but the result was movement patterns that appeared random while actually following complex mathematical relationships that Carathian computers couldn't decode. Communications specialist Emma Davis made the breakthrough that changed everything when she realized the aliens' greatest strength could become their greatest weakness. The Carathians' biomechanical nature required constant data exchange with their command networks to coordinate the adaptation and resurrection processes that made them so dangerous. Davis began feeding carefully designed false information into those networks during critical moments. The first test came when a group of Carathian warriors were killed by one of Johnson's construction mechs, and their resurrection process began normally. At the exact moment when their enhancement systems activated, Davis transmitted contradictory upgrade instructions that caused the biomechanical integration to malfunction. Instead of coming back stronger, the warriors' own technology began consuming them from the inside while their command network tried to process incompatible data streams. The effect spread through the alien forces like a virus as their interconnected systems attempted to adapt to threats that didn't actually exist while ignoring real dangers they couldn't classify. Warriors who should have been invincible began falling to weapons that barely qualified as weapons. Resurrection technology that had never failed began producing monsters that attacked their own forces because their targeting systems couldn't distinguish between enemies and allies. Wayne Scott had been an engineer on the mining platforms before. Clark recruited him for the Defense Force, and he understood industrial systems better than most people understood their own families. He realized the mining platforms could be converted into mobile battle stations that moved according to orbital mechanics rather than military tactics. The resulting flight patterns were completely unpredictable because they were based on gravitational relationships between multiple celestial bodies rather than strategic considerations. The Carathians found themselves fighting an enemy that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Human forces would disappear from one location and appear somewhere else following no logical transportation method. Weapons that should have been destroyed by alien countermeasures continued functioning because they weren't really weapons at all but industrial tools being used for purposes their designers never intended. Davis expanded her information warfare campaign as the battle progressed, and the results exceeded her wildest hopes. The Carathian command structure was designed for perfect coordination, but that perfection became a catastrophic weakness when false data began corrupting their networks. Ships began attacking each other because their identification systems received contradictory information about target classifications. Enhancement systems began damaging the warriors they were supposed to strengthen because upgrade protocols couldn't distinguish between beneficial and harmful modifications. The battle lasted 6 days instead of the expected few hours, and ended, not with human victory or defeat, but with something unprecedented in Carathian military history. The alien fleet withdrew from the battlefield while they still had forces capable of fighting. For the first time in their imperial expansion, they faced an enemy they couldn't understand well enough to defeat through adaptation and overwhelming force. Clark watched the alien ships retreat toward the outer system and realized the war had reached a turning point that no one had anticipated. Humanity hadn't won a military victory, but they had achieved something more valuable. They had proved that some enemies could be defeated not by becoming stronger than them, but by becoming more unpredictable than their ability to adapt could handle. The implications were staggering as reports from the battle spread throughout human space and beyond. Other species that had been conquered or threatened by various forces began studying human methods not to copy them, but to understand the value of controlled chaos and creative problem-solving when facing superior enemies who depended on predictability for their continued dominance. Commander Joe Rivers had been studying Carathian language patterns for 3 months when the alien transmission arrived at Earth's primary communication station. The message was unlike anything the species had ever sent before, and Rivers spent hours trying to understand not just the words but the meaning behind them. When he finally decoded the full message, he immediately contacted Admiral Carter because what the aliens were saying changed everything about the war. The Carathians were withdrawing from human space, but not because they had been defeated in any traditional military sense. Their message explained something that no other species had ever heard from the galactic conquerors. They acknowledged encountering an enemy whose strength came from embracing chaos rather than controlling it, and they admitted they could not adapt to fight such an opponent without risking the destruction of their own rigid command systems. Carter read the translation with growing amazement as the implications became clear. The aliens weren't retreating because they couldn't win individual battles against human forces. They were retreating because continued fighting would only make humans stronger and more unpredictable, while potentially causing catastrophic failures in Carathian coordination networks that had never been designed to process truly random data. Dr. Mary Kim published her landmark study on human cognitive flexibility 3 days after the alien withdrawal was confirmed, and her conclusions revolutionized understanding of why the war had ended so unexpectedly. Humanity's greatest strength wasn't superior technology or overwhelming firepower, though they possessed both in sufficient quantities. Their real advantage was the ability to find solutions in impossible situations and turn disadvantages into advantages through pure creative stubbornness. The study compared human psychological patterns to data from 17 other species that had fallen to Carathian forces, and the differences were remarkable. Every conquered civilization had fought, using their most advanced weapons and most proven tactics. They had followed established military doctrine and deployed their forces according to strategies that had worked for centuries against other enemies. All of them had been defeated because their approaches were fundamentally predictable. Humans approached warfare like they approached every other problem in their chaotic lives. They would try the obvious solution first, but if that didn't work, they would immediately start experimenting with alternatives that ranged from innovative to completely insane. More importantly, they would abandon successful tactics the moment those tactics stopped working and find entirely new ways to fight without any emotional attachment to their previous victories. General Steve Murphy established the Irregular Warfare Academy on the ruins of what had been a traditional military college and began training officers who would never fight a conventional battle in their entire careers. Students learned chaos theory alongside weapons training and studied probability mathematics as intensively as tactical doctrine. The curriculum included classes on improvisation and creative problem-solving that would have been considered useless before the war. Murphy's teaching methods were as unconventional as everything else about the new military philosophy. Students were given problems that had no correct solutions and were expected to find answers anyway. They practiced fighting with equipment that didn't work properly and learned to turn malfunctioning technology into advantages rather than handicaps. Most importantly, they learned to think like humans instead of trying to think like proper soldiers. The galaxy began to take notice as news of humanity's victory spread through diplomatic channels and trade networks. Species that had lived in fear of various conquering forces started requesting information about human military methods. Not because they wanted to copy human tactics, which would have been impossible given their different psychological makeup, but because they wanted to understand the principles behind controlled chaos as a defensive strategy. The crystalline beings of Vega Prime sent ambassadors to Earth for the first time in their species' history because they realized their logical nature had made them vulnerable to enemies who could predict their responses. They couldn't learn to think like humans, but they could learn to recognize when their own predictability was being used against them and develop strategies for breaking their own patterns when necessary. The Altarian Federation began restructuring their massive fleet based on lessons learned from human irregular warfare. They couldn't match human creativity, but they could organize their forces in ways that were less predictable and more adaptable. Instead of using the same battle formations that had served them for centuries, they developed modular tactics that could be recombined in different ways depending on the specific nature of each threat. Admiral Carter reflected on the war's conclusion from her office overlooking the rebuilt Titan Station complex and marveled at how humanity had won by refusing to fight like anyone expected them to. They hadn't developed superior technology or trained better soldiers or built larger fleets. They had simply been more human than their enemies could handle and that had been enough to save not just their own civilization, but potentially many others as well. The Carathian Empire underwent its own transformation as they attempted to understand what had happened to their previously invincible military machine. Some of their commanders argued for developing new tactics that could counter human unpredictability, but their scientists warned that trying to match human creativity might destroy the very coordination systems that made Carathian forces effective in the first place. Captain Ryan Brooks received promotion to Admiral and Command of the reformed Terran Defense Fleet, which would never again rely solely on conventional military thinking when facing unknown threats. His first directive established new protocols for dealing with enemies that possessed superior technology or numbers. Instead of trying to match their advantages, human forces would focus on being more unpredictable than enemy adaptation systems could handle. The war crimes tribunals that followed revealed the true scope of Carathian conquest across the galaxy, and the billions of beings who had died because their civilizations couldn't imagine fighting in ways that violated established military doctrine. The aliens had never been deliberately cruel, but their biomechanical nature and rigid hierarchy made them incapable of understanding species that didn't think in orderly patterns. Dr. Kim's follow-up research suggested that humanity's victory might represent an evolutionary advantage that had been developing for millions of years. Human ancestors survived not because they were the strongest or fastest predators on Earth, but because they could adapt to changing conditions faster than other species. The same flexibility that helped early humans survive ice ages and volcanic eruptions had proven effective against galactic conquerors who couldn't process truly chaotic opposition. The memorial erected at the site of Kepler 442b honored not just the defenders who had died there, but the principle they had discovered through their sacrifice. Sometimes the only way to defeat a superior enemy is to refuse to fight on their terms and force them to fight on yours instead. The inscription carved into the monument captured the essence of humanity's greatest military victory with simple words that would inspire generations of future defenders. No army could stop the Carathians until they met an enemy that didn't fight like an army at all, but like humans. Creative and unpredictable and impossibly determined to find a way forward when no way should exist. The galaxy learned that day that some battles are won not through superior force, but through superior humanity, and that lesson would never be forgotten by those who valued freedom over order and chaos over conquest.